Terrific. So I'm Alan Webb. I'm a professor in the English department. I'm a member of the executive committee of the Climate Change Working Group, and I'm going to introduce our speaker this evening. I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone, both those of you who are here in person and those of you who are joining us online. Of course, this talk tonight is part of the Climate Emergency Month that is being organized at Western Michigan University by the working group and also by many other offices, departments, groups, and participants on our campus, including the Office for Sustainability, the President's Office, and many other departments and so forth. And members of the community too. We've had a whole outpouring of organizations that have joined this Climate Emergency Month and are participating with it in many different ways. We're really delighted about that because we know how urgent it is that we address the climate crisis. I'd like to say a little bit about my dear friend Paul Clements before he speaks this evening. Paul has been a professor here at Western for nearly 20 years. He is a professor in the political science department, where he is the director of the master's degree program in international development administration. He has his bachelor's degree from Harvard University. After Harvard, he went into the Peace Corps, and he served not only a full term of the Peace Corps in the Gambia, but he stayed 4 extra years working for other development organizations. He then returned to the United States, where he got his master's and PhD at Princeton in the International School of International Policy. And we're really very fortunate to have him here on campus. He's published extensively in many different areas, including in project evaluation, international nonprofits and other organizations. And he's an expert on John Rawls, who's perhaps the leading political theorist of the 20th century. Paul has published a book on Rawls and many articles. You know, he was one of 3 people that more than 10 years ago founded the Climate Change Working Group at Western. And that group has become critical to me in my own education about the climate crisis and to many, many other people, and had a lasting influence in our community, leading to the establishment of the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition and so forth. Paul will be speaking this evening on the topic of ethics and politics of global climate justice. I know of no one better situated to speak about the climate crisis from a global perspective and from a justice perspective. So please join me in welcoming Paul's talk this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, for that very kind introduction. My topic tonight is not a happy topic, the ethics and politics of global climate justice. Climate change is inherently a global issue, but I think a very significant barrier to addressing it adequately, perhaps the most significant, is the failure of the United States, particularly, and to some extent other advanced countries, to take responsibility for their carbon pollution. A related issue is that within the United States, probably 99% of the energy of climate justice, climate activists is really focused at the local, state, and national level. And while all that work is critically important, I don't want to diminish it a little bit at all. Nevertheless, if we don't address international climate justice through our government, then the goals that we have domestically will not be adequate to the global issue. So I'm going to start with just 2 ethical questions. There are only 2 of the questions of many that are involved with the climate crisis. What responsibility do countries bear for environmental harms they impose on people in other countries? And secondly, what responsibility do citizens bear for environmental harms their country imposes on people in other countries? And I think that really, whatever ethical tradition we come from, at least in the Western tradition, they would pretty much agree with the 2 answers I'm going to propose. And that is to say, responsibilities of countries. If you're causing harms, you should stop imposing those harms as quickly as possible. And you should help to alleviate and redress the harms with priority to the more vulnerable countries and people. Responsibility to citizens? Well, as citizens of such a country, you should stop contributing to those harms as quickly as possible. But then there's also what we call an imperfect obligation to move their country to fulfill its responsibilities. But imperfect obligations were the ethical terms. And what it's talking about is when you have an obligation to a class of action, but not to any particular action within that class. So we say, for example, that people of means have an obligation to help the needy, to perhaps give to charity, but we don't have one doesn't have an obligation to give to particular charities. We have an obligation to promote social justice, but we don't have an obligation to promote climate justice or any other particular form of justice. However, if a lot of people don't promote climate justice, it's not going to happen. That's where we find ourselves. My basic political argument, I'll just read it here, is that for the world's countries to reduce the carbon pollution as called for by the Paris Agreement and to alleviate and redress harms from climate change adequately will require stronger international institutions. These institutions will only be built if more climate activists focus on moving their national governments to fulfill their responsibilities. And I'll flesh out this argument through the course of the presentation. So this leads to a key challenge for citizens. As I've said, most climate change activism is local, regional, and national for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and a just transition. But we also need to build the political power to encourage and push our government to do the right thing internationally, recognizing that this involves tough choices, difficult choices for our country and elsewhere. To do this, we need to identify the loose shape of a just international architecture and work to frame the international discourse in relation to this vision. And I admit this is hard for citizens, and our national environmental organizations are not well structured for these tasks. So if we want to look at the politics of global climate justice, it's helpful to think about it, I think, in this way. The climate crisis is a global problem, but politically, we can think about it coming from two perspectives, from advanced countries and from developing countries. In terms of mitigation, reducing carbon pollution, reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the advanced countries have high historic carbon pollution. For example, in the United States, our current carbon pollution, most advanced countries have high but falling carbon pollution currently. For example, the United States is at 15 tons per person per year, compared to India, we'll see at 2 tons per person per year. The advanced countries, the reason they're advanced is because they're industrialized. That makes them relatively rich. That's why they have this high historic carbon pollution. By contrast, for mitigation for developing countries, they have low historic carbon pollution. They haven't contributed much historically. Their current carbon pollution is usually low, but rising because they're needing to develop. And so we say that there's a right to development because they're relatively poor. In terms of adapting to the harms from climate change, there's significant need for adaptation for all the countries in the world, for everybody. But in the advanced countries, there are significant demands, but more resources. The harms from climate change definitely fall more heavily on the developing countries for a variety of reasons, partly because they're already hotter. And even though the harms fall more heavily there, they tend to have less resources to adapt to the various harms from climate change. So again, adaptation is trying to reduce the harms that are going to occur. Once those harms actually do occur, well, then you have to deal with those issues. And so again, in the advanced countries, we're going to have significant harms for people, but we have more resources to address them. In the developing countries, there are greater harms, and the terms that gets used for this in the international discussions is loss and damage. And of course, then they have less resources to address those harms. One particular harm that I think is perhaps the most significant issue for international climate justice and has in fact been neglected by the international community is the issue of climate migrants, people who have to leave their homes for one reason or another because of climate change. Through my own work, I've estimated that there could be as many as 400 million climate migrants by 2050 under sort of a not a very good case scenario, or in a better case scenario, we might see that number reduced to 200 million. But these are mostly people who leave their homes at a time when they've maybe lost everything and then go to perhaps the capital city or some slum most often in their country and have to start their life anew. So what about national responsibility? If we look at cumulative national carbon pollution, more or less since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, well, the United States is at the top of the list. We have contributed about a quarter of the global climate pollution. As of 2017, 399 billion tons. European Union, 22%, China, 13%, and India, 3%. I just used to give some sort of rough idea of where things stand across the world. In terms of current carbon pollution, the United States is at 15 tons per person per year, Germany 8, China 8, India 2, while the global average is 5 tons per person per year. I think that it's right to, because climate change is a global issue, it's right to think of it as binding the world's people together in a common destiny. And if we look at the challenges of mitigation, adaptation, and addressing harms, that if they're not addressed together in a coherent way, they will not be addressed adequately. So for mitigation, the question is, how much carbon pollution and other greenhouse gases are we going to emit? And then if we have a particular target for limiting, like for the Paris Agreement, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that implies a certain amount of carbon pollution that can go into the atmosphere. So then how do we share that global carbon budget fairly among countries? For adaptation, the adaptation challenges each country individually, preparing for the increased heat, drought, floods, sea level rise, and other effects of climate change. So there the issue is, how do the better off countries help the poorer countries? Similarly, for addressing harms from climate change, how do we compensate poor countries for loss and damage and support the victims, especially climate migrants? Well, so what does it mean to accept national responsibility? It means to accept the poorer countries' right to development. It means to accept hard targets, specific numeric targets for ending carbon pollution based on sanctions or actual consequences if a country exceeds its budget for fair financial, and for fair financial commitments to help developing countries. It means accepting and welcoming a fair share of climate exiles. Most climate migrants, most people who leave their homes, stay in their home countries. It's mostly when their governments are already breaking down for one reason or another, when their governments fail, that's the main time when we see large numbers of people leaving their countries that I'll call climate exiles. When there are these climate exiles, which today there are many, but in coming years there will be many times the numbers that there are today, and the advanced countries are going to need to accept some of these. And this is probably going to be a politically hot topic. And so finally, then, we're going to need to build stronger international institutions for mitigation, adaptation, and to support climate migrants. So it takes just a lot of organizational capacity and a lot of political support to do this. So what is our current architecture of international climate change institutions? It starts with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This was launched in 1992. The Framework Convention is both the text of the agreement that was agreed to in 1992 and has then been developed and advanced over the years. And it's also the organization that text launched in 1992 that nowadays usually meets every year in so-called conferences of the parties, COPs. And they name them by their sequence, COP21, COP15, etc. The original aim of the UNFCCC is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Well, this aim from 1992 has obviously failed. We obviously already have dangerous anthropogenic interference, but we just have to then move as quickly as possible to limit that interference. Another aim, or part of the text of this original agreement, was recognizing the responsibilities of advanced countries and the right to development of the developing countries. The goal stated in 1992, the target in that original agreement, was stated that the advanced countries aim to return to 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2000. It was understood that advanced countries bear greater responsibility. They need to take the step first, and they wanted to get back to, again, this level by the year 2000. However, sadly, this did not happen. If you look at this graph, this shows carbon pollution since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution up to 1990, and then up until almost the present day. And obviously, carbon pollution has just continued to increase ever since the beginning of the establishment of the UNFCCC. And we've actually had more carbon pollution since the launch of the FCCC, the UNFCCC, than in all the previous industrial time before, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So what about finance? In 1992, we said that the developed country parties shall also assist the developing country parties that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change in meeting the cost of adaptation to those adverse effects. And also that the developing countries, for them to fulfill their responsibilities, should depend on their getting the appropriate assistance from the advanced countries. The extent to which the developing country parties will effectively implement their commitments will depend on the effective implementation by developed country parties under the convention related to financial resource transfer and transfer of technology, and will take fully into account that economic and social development and poverty eradication are the first and overriding priorities of the developing country parties. This is what we agreed to as other countries did in 1992. Well, the first try was in 1997. COP3, the third meeting of Conference of Parties. They named these meetings after the city where they take place. They named the agreements after the city. So the Kyoto Protocols, it was in Kyoto. This agreement was the agreement was that the advanced countries would reduce their carbon pollution first, and then leave the developing countries to reduce theirs later on. Bill Clinton, our president at that time, and Al Gore, his vice president, wanted to sign this. The European countries pretty much all signed it, but the US Senate rejected it. And therefore, because it was going to be a treaty, the United States was not able to participate. Without US participation, it basically took the air out of the system. So as we saw from the graph, carbon pollution levels continued to increase. Then it was another, how many years? 12 years before there was further progress. This was partly because after Clinton, George Bush was elected president, and in that period from the year 2000, the Republican Party, largely due to planned effort by big oil companies. In fact, it was big oil companies that pushed the Senate to reject the Kyoto Protocols in the first place. They had a planned strategy that we've actually talked about during Climate Emergency Month to basically introduce climate science denial, and to make climate science denial became essentially a requirement to be a leading Republican politician, elected official during that period. And so George Bush was not willing to support any of the global climate change efforts. Without the United States, basically nothing was able to happen significantly on the international scale level. Until then, we got Barack Obama elected in 2008. So that in 2009, he sends Hillary Clinton, his Secretary of State, to COP15 in Copenhagen, and they're able to come up with this agreement that the advanced countries will provide $100 billion a year to help developing countries with mitigation and adaptation from the year 2020. So again, kind of a funny agreement. Then it was a few more years, 6 more years, before finally the international community could come to an actual agreement that virtually all the countries of the world could get behind, the famous Paris Agreement. We probably all know the goal there, to limit global warming to well below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, where the means to achieve it was nationally determined contributions. The Paris Agreement reaffirmed the commitment to $100 billion per year by 2020, and it added the principle to balance spending between mitigation and adaptation, where basically the advanced countries wanted to focus more on mitigation, reducing carbon pollution, but the developing countries wanted to have a fair share of support for adaptation. But these nationally determined contributions were just voluntary. They didn't bear any relation to historic or current carbon pollution. It's just whatever any country says it wants to do. At that time, the initial set of nationally determined contributions summed to between 3 and 3.5 degrees Celsius of warming. And actual national behavior at that time summed to, as far as the scientists would say, approximately 4 degrees Celsius of warming. At that time, there was no consistent approach to calculating emissions, no consistent monitoring, but most significantly, no sanctions for failing to reach the target. So you have a target, but it's basically a target on paper. If you don't reach your target, nothing happens to you. To give an example of how this works out, we can look at Vietnam, which at that time was a poor but rapidly industrializing country. They had at that time carbon pollution of 2.3 tons per person per year, versus at that time, United States, 16.2 tons per person. And their commitment was they're going to cut their emissions by 8% from the business as usual scenario by 2030. And because they're rapidly industrializing, they say, well, our business as usual scenario is we need to more than triple our emissions from 246 million tons in 2010 to 787 million tons in 2030. That's what we're going to do. But we're going to cut that. So instead of going up to 787, we're going to cut it by 8% and only triple our emissions to 744 million tons by 2030. However, if we get the financial and technological support through the Green Climate Fund, through the UNFCCC, then we're going to increase the emissions reduction target to 25% cut for business as usual to 652 million tons, which still is actually a 250% increase from the previous period. And so this is kind of an interesting way of how these things got negotiated. What about climate finance? Well, despite the $100 billion target that was agreed to 2009, by 2020, total aid, which was channeled through dozens of official aid organizations, was estimated at $80 billion, not the $100 billion that had been committed. At Paris Agreement, they set up this Green Climate Fund where the developing countries have half of the board seats, half of the management. But the advanced countries wanted to put most of their money through their own development agencies, through the World Bank, to other agencies where they have predominant control. A lot of the money was coming through loans. There was a lot of double counting. It goes through one organization to another, it just gets counted twice. There was a lot of recategorization of traditional development assistance, calling it climate finance. And the majority of aid was for mitigation, not for adaptation. The way countries get this aid is by requesting projects from these various organizations. And it turns out that the middle income or less poor countries are just better at requesting projects. So they got more of the support. The poorer countries just got less. They're not as good at it. And within the countries, the political priorities of the requesting governments often are not to support the most vulnerable. So the most vulnerable tend to be neglected. Well, during the last five or 10 years, as most of us probably know, we have seen really incredibly rapid development of solar and wind technologies. The cost has gone way down. And this has contributed to some, and the governments have done some things. This has contributed to some significant reduction in the rates of carbon pollution in terms of how they're expected to come over time. By COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, it now looked like current policies would lead to a best estimate of around 2.6 to 2.7 degrees Celsius, a significant reduction, with an uncertainty range of 2 to 3.6 degrees Celsius. And I know my wife doesn't like me to say this, but even though this is what the official numbers say, from my studies of these numbers, I think that these tend to be conservative. And I think we're way more likely to be at 3.6 than at 2 with the projections that they're talking about. If countries meet both conditional and unconditional nationally determined contributions for the near-term target of 2030, projected warming by 2100 falls to 2.4 degrees, with a range from 1.8 to 3.3. But again, I think probably closer to 3.3. So these conditional and unconditional, that's like what the Vietnam was saying. Their unconditional commitment was to the 8%. The conditional was to the 25%. And still, 2.4 degrees is still significantly above the Paris Agreement target. Also, we've been finding since the earlier years that the harms, even from 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, are a lot greater than were understood by science 10 or 15 years ago. What about the right to development? At our most recent COP, COP27, last November in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, the advanced countries said, all right, let's try to get everybody on board to at least phase out coal, the dirtiest fuel. But a lot of developing countries actually have a lot of coal. And if they're trying to continue to advance rapidly, they think they need that coal. And so China and India in particular rejected that language on the focus on the phase out of coal. Actually, both China and India are rapidly increasing their renewable energy. China is actually a leader in increasing renewable energy, but because its economy is growing very quickly, they're increasing renewable energy and they're increasing coal energy at the same time. Well, I think we should interpret this partly in terms of what's going on at the national with carbon pollution on a national level. When we talk about phasing out coal, United States at 15 tons makes a lot of sense. The global average is 5 tons. When we talk about the developed and developing countries in the context of UNFCCC, which side you stand on, you fall under, which side you fall under was established in 1992 at the time the UNFCCC was established. So China was considered to be, is considered to be a developing country in UNFCCC division. However, since this time, it's rapidly industrialized, so its level of carbon pollution is the same as Germany's. It's an upper middle income country. So I think for them to reject phasing out coal is very different than for India, which is only at 2 tons per person and also has a lot of coal supplies. And then I just use India as an example. If we look at most of the developing countries in Africa, say, they would be far below 2 degrees Celsius. Below 2 tons per person. So the lower income countries either need a lot more support to transition to renewable, or they need to be able to use whatever they have in order for their development if they're going to address poverty as basically they need and should do. What about mitigation? Where do we stand? Well, of course, the current framework from the Paris, which we still have from the Paris Agreement, is voluntary. It places the onus on each country regardless of responsibility. The developing countries just need financial and technical support if they're going to be able to carry through. To achieve the rapid greenhouse gas emission reduction from the Paris target, we need an agreement with teeth, with consequences for exceeding fair emission targets and for failing to fulfill financial obligations. And for this, it's going to require just stronger international organization. Again, international organization, partly just to do the actual work of transitioning a system from the polluting energy to the renewable energy, and partly the legal framework and the financial framework that will allow that transition to take place. What about adaptation? Well, we've seen that the harms from drought, sea level rise, stronger storms, hotter weather, rapidly changing ecologies, acceleration of extinctions, these harms are actually look like they're going to be even worse than was previously anticipated. And the current system for international support, the funds are just woefully inadequate. There's a complete consensus on this. Even $100 billion per year for mitigation and adaptation is nowhere close to what's actually needed. They're channeled through hundreds of established aid organizations. This is terribly inefficient, and it seldom reaches the most vulnerable. Harms from climate change? Well, it wasn't until actually last year, COP27, that the UNFCCC first finally established a separate fund for what they call loss and damage for addressing these harms, but with less than $300 million in commitments versus $80 billion for mitigation adaptation. Just one country, Pakistan, last year with a third of Pakistan being flooded, had costs of over $30 billion. That's over 100 times the commitment for loss and damage. This is just a laughably small amount. And what about climate migrants? There is no dedicated fund for climate migrants. The Paris Agreement mentions migrants only once in passing. In 2015 at Paris, the UNFCCC established a task force on displacement alongside the Paris Agreement, but it's limited to 14 members, basically to study the issue and to give advice. To put this issue in perspective, in 2022, UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, said that there were about at that time 100 million people displaced by conflict and violence. This is like the refugees of the world, the people who have had to leave their homes for what has historically been the strongest reason for displacement, which has been conflict and violence of one kind and another. That was before Ukraine, correct. So of that 100 million, by the way, that 100 million was already the most ever in history. If we go back 15 years, it would usually be around 40 to 50 million, and it's accelerated to 100 million in the recent period. Of that 100 million, 53 million were in place just internally to their country, within their home country, so-called internally displaced persons, and 47 million were internationally displaced. And the care for these international refugees, we already know, which has been in place and been developing over many decades, is already woefully inadequate. By 2050, by my estimates, we could have up to roughly 433 million people displaced by climate change, which is separate from the conflict and violence, 4 times the number from conflict and violence. About 140 million of these by sudden onset weather disasters, a storm that destroys their home, or sea level rises that washes their home away. And again, then they have to abandon their home and go somewhere else with no resources, with nothing, often in a country where it has very little means to support them. And 293 million by slow onset climate events, droughts, other slow onset effects of climate change. Well, this 433 million, I think, could quite likely be reduced by half if there's very strong mitigation and adaptation, and if there's strong socioeconomic and egalitarian socioeconomic development in these countries, so that if conditions are better, then you just have less migrants. But still, we're talking about something in the order of 200 million climate migrants, more than twice the current number of refugees, where the institution for supporting refugees are already woefully inadequate. So, what then are the responsibilities for heavy carbon polluters? Well, for an earlier deadline than developing countries, for whatever carbon budget, global carbon budget we get for achieving carbon neutrality. Basically, to achieve the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the scientists tell us that globally we need to be carbon neutral, have net zero carbon pollution by 2050. But if we're going to accept a right to development, the advanced countries should have an earlier target, maybe 2045, and the developing countries perhaps 2060, something like that, so they can have more chance to develop. We should help to cover costs for harms imposed on developing countries and on climate migrants. We're going to need substantial technical and organizational support for transitions to clean energy, adaptation, and migrant support. And as I've said, we need to welcome and integrate our fair share of climate exiles, international climate migrants. This, as I said, is going to require much stronger international institutions. We're going to need a consistent flow of billions of dollars with a level of national obligation based on historic and current carbon pollution. There need to be actual consequences for governments and countries that do not fulfill their obligations. We need to be prepared to protect the human rights of domestic and international climate migrants. There needs to be technical and organizational support for transitions to clean energy, adaptation, and supporting climate migrants. This is what it means to promote global climate justice. But if we look at the discourse, the discussion in the United States, these issues, for the most part, aren't part of the public consciousness. They're not even on the table. What we basically need is stronger, what you could call world government. But the popularity of the idea of world government, certainly in the United States, is not very high. However, it's not going to happen without at least US support. Now, historically, the European countries have been much stronger on these climate change issues than the United States. So I could see European countries taking the lead. But with European countries taking the lead, if the United States isn't actually going to be there at the table supporting, it just isn't going to happen. So in conclusion, since the international climate change negotiations were launched in 1992, annual levels of carbon pollution have continued to increase. This has increased the cost of harm from climate change to developing countries, which are not adequately addressed. There's a lack of policy on climate migrants. It's a gaping hole in the UNFCCC architecture, particularly considering the scale of unjust harms. I would consider this to be the central climate change justice issue. Obviously, that we need for stronger international institutions for mitigation, adaptation, and support to migrants with advanced countries accepting responsibility. And this is only going to happen with strong domestic political pressure on advanced country governments, particularly the US government. And this can only come from US citizens. But as I've said from the beginning, if we look at the work of climate activists, this has not really been the focus. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing because that way I can see if there are questions coming. Okay, we have a few participants on the Zoom. So I would like to, I'd be happy to take any questions, and I've opened the questions thing on Zoom in case anyone on our webinar would like to type in a question. Susan. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the League of Conservation Voters, the Sierra Club, they'll talk about these things. If I have not attended any of the COP meetings, but if you go to the COP meetings, there are a whole host of NGOs that are there pushing on these issues. But if you just consider the money, the resources behind that action, and if you compare that to the money and the resources that are devoted to the other levels of climate action, it's 99-1, easily. Alan?
Well, yours is forming committee I know about how to take political action. You run for Congress, you're very involved in local politics and raising funds and so forth. What kind of things might we do? I mean, I'm going to say at the local level because you mentioned, Susan mentioned a couple of nationals. Maybe we need to make local chapters. What kind of things can we do to try to support this different perspective on the international climate justice that you're talking about?
I think that the right thing to do, I think that the League of Conservation Voters, the Sierra Club, the Climate Hawks, Citizens Climate Lobby, that given their membership and their structure, that they're inevitably going to focus most of their energy at the domestic level. So I think that the right thing to do is to establish basically, I could say a new organization or new organizations where their mission is at this international level, and then framing it in terms of, again, framing it in terms of a vision of what a just institutional structure is going to look like, that essentially we're going to have stronger international organizations for mitigation, adaptation, and addressing the harms. It's going to have to happen one way or another. If it doesn't happen, we get the lifeboat Earth scenario where it becomes a militarized conflict and international cooperation breaks down. It's just a question of, is it going to be sooner or later? And the later it happens, the worse the harms are going to be. And so developing the vision of what the international organization should look like in some kind of reasonably just way is a good first step. And then to basically organize membership, build strategy, deploy resources to work essentially with Congress and with the administration in the United States to push the Congress and the administration at the UNFCCC basically support these positions. Again, I perfectly appreciate that, okay, let's have a global organization that can tax America. You know, how well is that going to fly in our current Congress? Not very well. But that's exactly what we need, and we're not going to solve the problem without something like, without that, indeed. It can tax the United States and can tax other countries in terms of the requirements for mitigation, adaptation, and harms. So as daunting as the prospect sounds, there's no other pathway than the international pathway to address these issues. In fact, if you want to know a little bit more about how this might be done, I am designing an organization that could address this. You can look on the web, enlightenmentproject2.org, that would lay some of this out. If you want to talk with me about that sometime, take a look at it. I'd be happy to talk about it. But also, I think that the analysis that I lay out on that website develops from the argument that I've made here tonight about the kind of organization that would be necessary to focus appropriately on national responsibilities and on building the international institutions that we know are needed. Tim?
Just a comment. Citizen Climate Lobby does have an international aspect, chapters around the world, and a separate associated organization called Citizen Climate International. They were at the COP27 meeting, including the executive director of the Climate Lobby.
Yeah, and you know, Sierra Club, League of Conservation Voters, a lot of these organizations are there. But if you look at how the resources are deployed, and if we look at just all of climate action and all of climate justice work in the United States, the 99-to-1 proportion is probably generous. Susan? Yeah, there's all kinds of, I mean, that's definitely, you know, one of the mechanisms. There are all kinds of mechanisms that are on the table that need to be developed. It's certainly finance is a big part of the equation, and certainly current finance is nowhere near adequate. In addition to the finance, there's also the actual organization at the international level, at the national level, to implement it effectively, which is a whole, I mean, since I teach international development, I sort of pay attention to these things as what's going on. I mean, if you try to address, bring in renewable energy in Mali today, it would take a lot of work, because Mali has plenty of sunshine, but they have various things going on. They have limitations to their government, and organizing that for just Mali as one example would be an enormous task. And that's the task that needs to be carried out. Alan?
On this climate migrant issue, when Diane Vince was here, she talked about two factors that she hoped developed countries would take into account. One of them is this depopulation. In other words, that the population is decreasing in many or most developing countries. It would be in this country, except for immigration, I think. She also argues that migrants and immigrants, contrary to public belief, actually do really lead to increased gross domestic product, and rather than costing the government money, or maybe cost some money in the first year or so they're here, they end up generating revenue through their own employment and taxes that they pay and so forth. So that migrants are going to fill an increasingly important need to address supporting older people, such as myself. I plan to retire eventually, for example, just to make it personal. But not only that, they will be helping the whole economy. And so, and yet we have such a broad political argument in this country, including among the Democrats as well, that there's a danger with immigrants, that they threaten American jobs, that they threaten American law, that they somehow are, likely to be, well, Trump called them rapists and so forth, which is the opposite. They're less likely to be committing crimes than citizens. And so how do we help people recognize this urgent advantages that would come to a country like the United States by accepting migrants and develop a different attitude, a more, as Pope Francis would talk about it, an attitude more brother, seeing our people around the world as our brothers and sisters rather than as our enemies.
So the first part to my answer to that is that yes, certainly immigration historically and today tends to be an advantage to the countries that receive the immigrants. We do need to acknowledge that when we talk about climate migrants, we're talking about people who have been forced to leave usually very low income countries out of in a distressed situation, who are actually a different sort of demographic from the migrants that we receive. The migrants we get today are people who choose to come, predominantly, majority of them, who choose to come for whatever reasons. And these are people who would be forced to come and who wouldn't have made that kind of preparation. So it is a more challenging thing. But also, look, the politics of immigration in the United States is obviously not based on rationality. I mean, clearly, one part of the equation is that if we look at US government policy in the last 30 years, it hasn't been supportive of the laboring classes. And the laboring classes, although immigration does help the economy, the people who see themselves most immediately threatened by immigration are the laboring classes. And so there's certain legitimacy to their resentment. So it's I think that, you know, the reason our Democratic Party is not more ambitious about immigration is because they see it as a losing ticket, a losing argument for winning elections. So the fundamental issue is what you got to in the beginning, Alan, and that is to say that what's just and what people are willing to accept today, what most citizens want today in the United States, is far apart. And I think that I'm not going to expect Democratic people running for Congress to run on a platform they think is going to lose them the election on a regular basis. All right. I'd like to see some Democrats, you know, taking a risk, but I'm not going to expect that on a wide scale basis. So again, what it means is that climate activists and others need to be pushing the imperative that we need to be prepared to accept climate migrants because we cause their problem. We have a responsibility to them, which is more and different from the situation of the majority of migrants that we get today who come for their own initiative. I do have a question here on the webinar, so I'm going to read it out loud. It comes from David Burkham. Are you aware of the degrowth movement to actively disassemble economic drivers of carbon emissions? It constitutes a program of rapid economic adaptation followed by disassembly towards economic justice. Could this be a possible driver of change from the ground up in developed economies? I'm not familiar with the details of the degrowth movement, but as an activist, but also as a political scientist, I would say that we certainly, as part of our climate justice, climate action movement, we certainly need to be encouraging people to reduce their own carbon pollution. That's just part of the story. We need to be encouraging our institutions to do that. But I think politically and technologically, does it make more sense to push for and anticipate, let's say, for example, reducing, like having negative economic growth as a strategy, but by reducing the activities that produce carbon pollution? Or does it make more economic and political sense for a more rapid push towards renewable energies that we know are there, but that still can allow for some level of economic growth? And I just think from a strategic level or a practical level, it makes more sense to push for more rapid sustainable energy, which then you can, you know, with plentiful solar and wind energy, you can still have economic growth. So I don't know to what extent that specifically addresses the arguments of the degrowth movement, because I'm not intimately familiar with it. But that's my sort of big perspective there.
That's one more question.
Yeah, behind you. Yeah.
I have to ask, how do we disarm the fossil fuel industries in our government?
Yeah. So the strongest reason that the United States has been unwilling to take responsibility, that the United States has been unwilling to play a role in the international community, is because of effective strategies by the oil companies and the other carbon polluting companies. They play their game, and they continue to play their game, and that's the political reality that we face. Exactly. No, there's no question about that. I mean, those of you who remember my campaign against Fred Upton, when he was literally receiving hundreds of $1,000s from the Koch brothers, partly because he himself had supported their positions. He had co-authored a letter to the editor in Washington, in the Wall Street Journal, about how the government shouldn't be getting involved in regulating carbon emissions. I forget the exact details of it, but he was hand in hand with the Koch brothers and getting their money. So this is a local thing that we face right here, and it's a national thing for sure. But that's the reality. I mean, the opposition is the carbon money, and so the political power that needs to be built has to be built recognizing the true structure of the problem. And that means we need to build enough political power, and it's going to take some money, but there's no way that it can get as much money as the oil companies can put up to protect their profits. Therefore, it has to be built on the ideological and organizing people basis. That's the only way forward. But you're completely right. We definitely have to take into account and to address the ongoing strategies that we know are going to come from the oil companies and other carbon polluters. That's the fight.
Well, this brings me to what I was going to ask, because I fully remember this is something we talked about in our class today. We read this book, Electrify, by Saul Griffin. And in that book, he talks about how, perhaps rather than fighting the oil companies, we should collaborate with them. What we should do is we should pay them for a significant percentage of their, fossil fuels that are staying in the ground. There's some the money they would lose if that stuff came out, and they would then tell them that we'll give you so many trillions of dollars if you not stop taking carbon out of the ground and instead put all your force into renewable energy. I mean, to me, these people, the word mass murders float around this month, various contexts, but these people, knew from 1970 or whatever what was going to happen, and then paid $100 million to lie about it. I'm willing to use that phrase for them, but what about that as a strategy? What about actually saying, okay, the super rich companies, here's trillions more, stop your fight against renewable energy and leave the carbon on the ground.
So in that scenario, I guess the money is going to come from taxes.
Have to. You have to take forward the working class people's money and give it to Exxon.
I would rather organize the working class people with pitchforks. Well,
no other questions, or anybody else has got a pitchfork? We'll be heading out up the hill with carrying pitchforks and torches. With this day. But thank you very much, Paul, for a fabulous talk. Really great question.
And thanks to everybody who attended on the webinar.